Internet is slow today. All right, here we go. Okay, and that is, we've done all that, and still there's nobody new that has joined. So I think we're there.
You've got everybody trained up. 10 o'clock.
That's right. That's right.
More or less.
This is in our staff meetings and whatnot. It's worked this way as well now too, where we say we're going to meet at 2 o'clock, and there are still a couple people who get there early and a couple people who get there late. But like 1:59 and 30 seconds, this flood of people will show up. Everybody is just right on it. Okay, so we have today a lot of fun in chapter 11, chapter 12, and I'm hoping we'll push even through chapter 12, though the last couple of weeks we have been slow, and that's okay. As slowly and methodically as we have gone last week especially, I'm not going to spend too much time in a review session today because we really spent a lot of time in chapter 10 last week and a lot of time reviewing last week. So I want to push us into chapter 11 fairly quickly. That said, any key takeaways in the next 5 minutes to review those folks who were not here last week as to what occurred in chapter 10 and what's going on in the larger narrative of Solomon. No critical points? We should have just skipped that chapter. Why did it take us a whole hour if there's nothing important?
Did you want to review the notes, how God wants to be worshipped?
So how God wants to be worshipped, can you say more? Is that from chapter 9 mostly, or chapter 8?
I think it's 10.
It's from chapter 10, okay.
Or did I?
Oh, you're fine, you're
A
fine.
lot of it is the discussions about Sheba.
Right.
And riddles to Solomon.
Right.
Just of the wisdom of Solomon.
Good. So we had the visit of the Queen of Sheba, and we had much discussion about who Sheba is, her relevance to the story, the riddles that she asks, and the development of the relationship between Solomon and Sheba, as well as Solomon and basically all of the different surrounding neighbors. We can think now that he has some sort of alliance with the people in Egypt through Pharaoh's daughter. He has an alliance with the king of Tyre and the people of Tyre. He has an alliance with Sheba, who is either in what we would call present-day Ethiopia, or the lower end of the Arabian desert around what we would call Yemen. And either way, he's got neighbors to the south, to the west, and to the north. To the east of him is desert. So he's pretty well secure now in his place, and he's developed a huge amount of wealth. At a large narrative level, those are the facts. And then our interpretation of those facts is, at least in part, that he's building an empire that rivals the empire of Egypt, or in the future, the empire of Assyria or Babylon. He's doing empire building the way that it's been done. And it's a little bit beyond just being a king at this point. And so we just kind of looked at that with something of a skeptical eye as it relates to the desire of the people for a monarch, the promises that would happen if they had a monarch, God's desire to be at the center of the people, all that kind of stuff. What else?
And we learned the Hebrew word for breathless spirit.
Yes.
Ruach.
Yeah, ruach, right? Spirit in, that guttural is great. So the word spirit we talked about a little bit in Hebrew is ruach. R-U-A-C-H is usually how that's transliterated. And that when Sheba sees all that Solomon has, some terrible translations say that her spirit leaves her, or something along those lines, when a much simpler translation would have been that she was breathless. Took her breath away. Okay, anything else? All right, this is efficient review. I like it. I like it. So we're going to jump into chapter 11. And at the end of last week, we read just a few verses of chapter 11 to prime the pump, so to speak, that anytime we have something like this where we see, okay, this is the height of this civilization, the golden age of Solomon's reign. And we have these little things in there that make us wonder about whether or not everything is aligned with God's purpose. We should expect things to start falling apart pretty soon. That's the narrative device that we have seen so far in this section of the Bible that we call the Deuteronomistic history. That is the history related to the theme of Deuteronomy. And that theme is do what is good in God's sight, follow his statutes, laws, commandments, and ordinances, and life will be given to you. Do what is wicked in God's sight, stray from God's ways, violate God's statutes and ordinances and laws, and things will fall apart. And so we looked at the first few verses of chapter 11 to see it start to fall apart, or at least to see the beginnings of that story. So we'll turn there today. I just noticed in the chat, is there any significance in the 666 talents of gold? I don't think so, or at least I've never come across that. There's no real significant numerology related to that number until we get to the book of Revelation. And while it'll be about 10 years before we ever make it to Revelation, the numerology there is very difficult to pinpoint. It seems in large part that it's pointing at some level to the emperor of Rome at that point, but this is not like a long-standing, in the same way that 40 or 7 or 3 is a long-standing biblical history of using those in numerology. That's not as true with 666. Though again, I could be wrong, and I hate to rob anybody else of the opportunity to look at that and say, "Oh, I see something there." I've never seen anything there personally. And that's my guess is that's just to tell you how I've never seen anything there. I'm guessing that is if you added all of the talents that have been named of gold, that's the cumulative total, which I didn't even know for what it's worth. Yeah, Judy, go ahead.
I was going to say this, you mentioned something about God's Hamas.
Yes, good. We asked for your homework to take a look at the different gods from chapter 11. So we're going to do that right now. Let's go ahead and jump in there. I'm going to pull up the text on your screen. Scroll up. I'm also going to sneeze probably. Let's see if I can stare at a light and make that go away. All right. Okay. Chapter 11, verse 1. King Solomon loved many foreign women along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women. From the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the Israelites, you shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for they will surely incline your heart to follow their gods. Solomon clung to these in love. Among his wives were 700 princesses and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. I just love the biblical way of making that their fault. When Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. We laughed at the irony of that last week also. For Solomon followed Astarte, the goddess of the Sidonians, Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. So Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and did not completely follow the Lord as his father David had done. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites, on the mountain east of Jerusalem. He did the same for all his foreign wives who offered incense and sacrificed to their gods. All right, so last week I said, why don't you Google or check out the Bible Odyssey website. I think there might have been an article or two there. Who are these? Astarte, Molech and Chemosh in particular. What'd you find? Scott Simcoe, let me get you popped up on the screen here. Go ahead.
Yeah, my notes in my Bible say that Astarte was a Canaanite goddess corresponding to the Mesopotamian goddess Ishtar, later identified with Aphrodite and Venus. In extra biblical texts as well as the Old Testament, she is usually portrayed as the consort of Baal,
Yes.
the Canaanite storm god representing fertility.
Yep.
She was particularly popular among the Phoenicians as a leading female deity in both Tyre and Sidon. Milcom, an Ammonite deity whose name is derived from a Semitic root meaning king or ruler, is usually also identified with Baal. And Shamash is the chief deity of Moab.
Okay.
And Molech, usually known as a deity worship outside of Jerusalem in the valley of Hinnom. That's all I got.
Okay. Good. Anybody else? That's all like, just overview stuff related to them, right? This is the pantheon of the tribes around. And just to complicate things a little bit, remember that in all likelihood, the Israelites or the Hebrew people was a Semitic tribe within the context of all these Semitic tribes. And the story is how they have cultural dominance, but it's at one point, all of these gods or deities mixed together a whole lot more. So there's always this kind of magnetic pushing and pulling happening that draws lines of similarity, but there are major lines of difference, especially with a couple of them. So one Scott named, the cycle related to Baal and Astarte, she goes by a couple of different names even in the ancient Canaanite, is a cycle of fertility, that you have to have both of them involved to complete the cycle of fertility and guarantee that you'll have crops and rain and all sorts of other sort of stuff. And that's not the case. There is no henotheistic viewpoint in which you need the interaction of the gods to determine the fruitfulness of the land, because there's one God that is the chief deity in the Israelite understanding. And it's still henotheistic. Again, nobody's denying the existence of these gods. It's not monotheistic, meaning that there is only one God and there are no other gods. It's henotheistic, but all of those other gods have been stripped of their power in the purest sense of the Israelite religion at this point, not necessarily how it's practiced. How it's practiced is a lot of people think, yeah, we better go offer some sacrifices from time to time to keep Baal happy or Astarte happy or something along those lines. That covers a couple of them. What about Chemosh and Molech? There's something about those two that sits together as a group. Anybody find that? I should say that groups the two of them.
What was the question again?
Chemosh and Molech, those two are grouped together in some thought, and it's because of practices that are associated with their cults. There's something a little bit more unifying about those two as a pair than all the gods just named for the sake of being named. I was curious if anybody found that. All right, so I'll do the shorthand version. In order to keep Chemosh happy from time to time, it seems to be the case that people needed to sacrifice human beings from time to time to keep him happy. And the same is true for Molech, but for Molech, it's not adults, it's children. That's the association that grows. And some of it comes from extra biblical sources and some of it comes from biblical sources. But when there's discussion of the two of them, that's conceptually, that's often in the background, is to pass children through the fire of Molech is for a lot of people anyway, considered to be a representation of the cult of human sacrifice related to that deity. So there you go. All that, it's really hard to get to the bottom of a whole lot of that stuff, but But in any case, some of that's there. Some of that's there. Okay, anything else that you
Okay.
noticed? Yeah, Louise, go ahead.
I didn't notice anything, but there's a short description in my notes in the Jerusalem Bible that I think gives us a look at what we've been talking about before and what's going to happen next. And it says, Solomon's foreign marriages were contracted for political ends, and the pagan shrines were intended for his wives and for traders. Such contracts, however, jeopardized the purity of the religion of Yahweh, and the author interprets the situation in the spirit and language of Deuteronomy.
Yes, good.
God punishes this form of impurity by raising up enemies abroad, verses 14f.
Oh,
And
yes.
so that's what's coming,
Yes,
but it's a deuteronomistic
absolutely.
interpretation. Yeah.
Good, very good, right? So remember that we're always dealing in Deuteronomy in Deuteronomistic history, I should say, with a text that's taking place, is rooted in history in a particular spot, but it's almost always retrospective. So, because remember that a lot of this comes around the time of Josiah, and we'll see Josiah here shortly. And we'll see Josiah here referenced shortly. We'll also get to Josiah in 2 Kings. But the idea is that during Josiah's reign, you look back at all of the history and you say, oh, this is why God allowed for or caused these things to happen. And so, yes, within this chapter, God will raise up foreign enemies. And we'll get to that very, very shortly. And the reference to Deuteronomy, I think, is in chapter 7. Does anybody have a Bible that gives you the exact note there?
Let's see.
One through 6.
Okay. Make no covenant with these, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. You've heard about them. Make no covenant with them. Show them no mercy. Do not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons or taking their daughters for your sons, for that would turn away your children from following me to serve other gods. Then the anger of the Lord would be kindled against you, and he would destroy you quickly. Good stuff. I mean, terrible stuff, but also good sleuthing. That's good. That's where we're coming from. All right, let's jump back in the text so that we don't have to wallow in our suspense too long. So, as Yahweh promised, Yahweh is angry. Verse 9. Yahweh was angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from Yahweh, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice, and had commanded him concerning this matter that he should not follow other gods. But he did not observe what the Lord had commanded. Therefore, Yahweh said to Solomon, since this has been your mind, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes that I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and give it to your servant. Yet for the sake of your father David, I will not do it in your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. I will not, however, tear away the entire kingdom. I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. And so this tribe, well, we'll talk about it maybe as we go along. Sorry, I'm too excited today. Yahweh raised up an adversary against Solomon, as Louise mentioned. Hadad the Edomite, he was of the royal house in Edom. For when David was in Edom and Joab the commander of the army, he went up to bury the dead, he killed every male in Edom. For Joab and all Israel remained there 6 months until he had eliminated every male in Edom. And Hadad fled to Egypt with some Edomites who were servants of his father. He was a young boy at the time. They set out from Midian and came to Paran. They took people with them from Paran and came to Egypt, to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, who gave him a house, assigned him an allowance of food, and gave him land. It had found great favor in the sight of Pharaoh, so that he gave him his sister-in-law for a wife, the sister of Queen Tahpenes. The sister of Tahpenes gave birth to him, or birth by him, I should say, to his son Genubath, whom Tahpenes weaned in Pharaoh's house. Genubath was in Pharaoh's house among the children of Pharaoh. When Hadad heard in Egypt that David slept with his ancestors and that Joab, the commander of the army, was dead, Hadad said to Pharaoh, let me depart, that I may go to my own country. Pharaoh said to him, what do you lack with me that you now seek to go to your own country? And he said, no, do let me go. Here's a pause there for a second. If you were to classify the history there of Hadad, what would you say? What are the like a couple of adjectives to describe a person of this type? He survived political warfare and fled. What do you call somebody who does that and seeks asylum in another country?
Refugee?
A refugee, right? He's seeking refuge or asylum in Egypt with a deep and traumatic wound in his psyche, we might say, related to the violence that had been done by Solomon's father. And is it likely that while in Egypt he forgets that? No. Now, the way that the text is trying to paint this for us, we have Yahweh raising up this enemy, but Yahweh's not starting from scratch, is he? Like this is God working with something that was very likely to happen. So here's that two-level drama working for us, right? The deity of the universe who's in charge of everything somehow, and yet if you stripped Yahweh out of this picture entirely, and you had a young male, one of the only surviving males to flee from David and seek political asylum, raised up in the house of Pharaoh, and it's certainly foreseeable that he says, okay, David's dead now. I'm going to go back and try to reclaim my territory and get into a battle with the new king of Judah and in Israel. This is all very likely, right? Anyway, just pointing that out. Anything else you notice about it? Okay, we'll see this sort of pattern again. God raised up another adversary against Solomon, verse 23, Rezon, son of Eliada, who had fled from his master, King Hadadezer of Zobah. He gathered followers around him and became leader of a marauding band after the slaughter by David. They went to Damascus, settled there, and made him king in Damascus. King's probably a little too strong of a word translation. He was an adversary of Israel all the days of Solomon, making trouble as Hadad did. He despised Israel and reigned over Aram. Probably self-explanatory, basic same typology, right? Like this is somebody who probably should have died during David's reign, but escapes and has some significant power and a militia of sorts. Verse 26, Jeroboam, son of Nebat, an Ephraimite of Zereda, a servant of Solomon, whose mother's name was Zeruiah, and a widow, rebelled against the king. The following was the reason he rebelled against the king. Solomon built the Millo and closed up the gap in the wall of the city of his father David. The man Jeroboam was very able, and when Solomon saw that the young man was industrious, he gave him charge over all the forced labor of the house of Joseph. There's some irony in there. We'll need to come back to that. About that time, when Jeroboam was leaving Jerusalem, the prophet Ahijah, the Shilonite, found him on the road. Ahijah had clothed himself with a new garment. The two of them were alone in the open country when Ahijah laid hold of the new garment he was wearing and tore it into 12 pieces. He then said to Jeroboam, take for yourself 10 pieces, for thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel, see, I am about to tear the kingdom from the hand of Solomon and will give you 10 tribes. One tribe will remain his for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city that I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel. We just heard that a moment ago, right? This is because he has forsaken me, worshipped Astarte, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of Moab, Milcom, the god of the Ammonites, and has not walked in my ways, doing what is right in my sight, and keeping my statutes and my ordinances as his father David did. Nevertheless, I will not take the whole kingdom away from him, but will make him ruler all the days of his life for the sake of my servant David, whom I chose, and who did keep my commandments and my statutes. But I will take the kingdom away from his son and give it to you, that is, the 10 tribes. Yet to his son I will give 1 tribe, so that my servant David may always have a lamp before me in Jerusalem, the city where I have chosen to put my name. I will take you. You shall reign over all that your soul desires. You shall be king over Israel. If you will listen to all that I command you, walk in my ways, do what is right in my sight by keeping my statutes and my commandments, as David my servant did, I will be with you and will build you an enduring house, as I built for David, and I will give Israel to you. For this reason, I will punish the descendants of David, but not forever. Solomon sought therefore to kill Jeroboam, but Jeroboam promptly fled to Egypt, to King Shishak of Egypt, and remained in Egypt until the death of Solomon. Just to close out the chapter, verse 41, now the rest of the acts of Solomon, all that he did, as well as all his wisdom, are they not written in the book of the acts of Solomon? And we would say, we don't know, we don't have that book anymore. Darn it. The time that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years. Solomon slept with his ancestors and was buried in the city of his father David, and his son Rehoboam succeeded him. Okay. What did you notice? There's a lot of good stuff there, or terrible stuff, but good material. What you got?
You know, in this chapter 43, it says, Rehoboam, his son, reigned in his stead.
Mm-hmm.
I thought Yeshua came after Solomon.
Jeroboam and Rehoboam are, they both have the same beginning of their reign date. If you were to look up the chart, they both begin to reign in 928. At least that's
No,
my understanding.
I Googled all that ancestry thing, and that's where on that chart it says after Solomon came Yeshua. I have no, no dog in the fight who came when.
I don't know. I could definitely be missing something.
No. I
had a person, I teach in one of the diocesan classes, and somebody the other day said something about David being the 3rd king of the Israelites, and I got so upset. How could this person possibly miss this? It's Saul and then David, obviously, but the way that he was reading it, there was the son Ishbosheth, remember, of Saul. Technically, one could read that as being I see that as interregnum, but he saw that as being the next king and David being the king after. So, there's some possibilities that I don't always understand. Okay, what else did you notice from the chapter?
The place that Hadad came from, where was that? It was Edomites or something. Is that the northern province? I'm just curious.
Right. So where is Edom? Let's pull that up on a screen for us. I mean, it might be helpful to remember Edom as well as Moab and all these different areas, but we'll just pop up Edom. Here, that looks like that's a terrible map. Why did I click on that map of Assyria? Weird. Come on, Wikipedia, help us out. Always difficult with Wikipedia too. There we go. So we should probably at this point in the game consider Edom more like, this is 600 BC. We should probably think of it being more in this area, south and east of the Dead Sea. It might have stretched down here, but you have to remember that Solomon's been expanding and expanding and expanding territory. David's been expanding territory. In all likelihood, this sort of crimson color and everything that is sort of west here, if you were to keep drawing a line down from the Jordan to the Red Sea, all this is not really Edom anymore during this period of time. Hopefully that's kind of helpful. All right, what else? Oh, and then you know where Damascus is, right? So that's where he starts, but he's now way up in Syria. Cheryl, I see you. You are muted, though. I'm sorry. I see you, but I don't hear you.
How about now?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm just curious because 10 of the tribes are given to Jeroboam.
Yeah.
But the one that is most coveted stays with Solomon.
Right.
In my mind, that one you give to the person that's not, trampling all the laws.
Yeah.
And you'd give some undesirable thing to Solomon. So
Right.
I don't know. That's something that I was curious about.
Yeah, there's a lot of curiosity there. Let's explore that for a second. Very good. So let's start just with there. So we have the 10 northern tribes basically being given away to Jeroboam. But God keeps saying, but I'm going to let Solomon stay in Jerusalem and finish out his days there. And then we'll explore the story beyond that. But that's the motive, it seems, for Yahweh to let Solomon retain Jerusalem. Solomon has to also have control over Judah. If we're looking chronologically forward, that's how that works. If we're looking in retrospect, we know that there's a civil war that's happening in this chapter. I mean, it's already boiling. And so there's a split between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The southern kingdom retains the land of Judah, which is expansive and much larger. And so at some level, this is ideological related to that, meaning that it's the origin story of that split. The other oddity there is 10 northern tribes to make up the land, the kingdom that we will now call Israel in the north. Judah is in the south. What about Benjamin? Like that's 11 tribes. We have up to 14, depending on how we want to count them, but at least 12. I mean, 12 is definitely how we want to count. So what happens with Benjamin? And so this seems to reflect a period of time in which Benjamin was understood to be a part of Judah and didn't have its own tribe anymore. It was just sort of assumed into the tribe of Judah, or Benjamin was understood to be sort of coterminous with Jerusalem, that those are the same thing. And so for God to say Judah and Jerusalem is to say Judah and Benjamin. I think that's a little bit odd. I think it's much more likely that at this period of time, the two have basically been consolidated, and to say Judah was to say Judah and Benjamin together. But that's one way of reading it. And so, yeah, all really interesting stuff, and especially the way it's coming out in this almost like shorthand. It's just, there's so many assumptions that we're going to be able to see exactly what the narrator's trying to show us here. It's almost unfair. Landon.
Yeah, I just noticed, I think, continuing the irony that we had noticed earlier, in that like two of the that rose up against Solomon were from when David was still king.
Right.
And then yet it says later, where is it? Verse 37, verse 38. Keeping my statutes and commandments like my servant David, and yet these two, rose up because of the slaughter of David and like the pretty terrible things that David actually did. And they're just kind of continuing that irony.
Yeah, there's tremendous irony there, right? Like this is theoretically the same narrator who told us all the times that David violated the covenant of Moses at the very least, and yet this editor also loves to whitewash, and I like to think, and I'm biased toward thinking this, I always like to think that editor knows that we know, and there's always kind of a wink behind it, like, David, who was just perfect, right? And it's no. But at the very least, we have to see the irony, and it's not irony that makes us laugh. There's a tragic irony to all this. We've talked about family systems theory a whole lot. This notion that this intergenerational or multi-generational pain transmission is going to keep happening. And it's happened all along in this story. The seeds of the pain that will be experienced later are planted generations before. If you go all the way back to Moses, remember we're often uncomfortable with that language when Yahweh says to Moses, I'm abounding in love and I'm steadfast and slow to anger and of great kindness and all that sort of stuff, but I'm never going to forget your sins. And I will visit them upon your children and your children's children to the 1,000th generation. And while we don't like to think of that as God holding on to some, cosmic tally sheet and saying like, oh, you know what, it's time to revisit the naughty list and pass some pain their way. What the Bible guarantees us is that the pain that we experience in our lifetime is not always due to the actions of people in our lifetime. And so here we see it. We see it again. There's another way of highlighting that in this same chapter. I wonder if anybody noticed the other one. We have one generation back to David. That's for sure. Anything else that you noticed from generational pain and suffering? And tragic irony?
It's probably.
We have had a lot so far. Various little hints that talk to us about the relationship between present day Israel and Judah, the united monarchy under Solomon, and formerly 480 years ago, the Hebrew people's captivity in Egypt. We've had all sorts of hints dropped along the way, and they start to kind of ramp up. So here we have people, being raised in Pharaoh's household and as foreign children who are going to be pulled out of Pharaoh's household by Yahweh for a dramatically ironic purpose in comparison to the way that God called the Hebrew people out. And here we have, let's see, verse, is it 28? The man Jeroboam was an able fellow, and Solomon saw that the lad could carry out these tasks, and so he appointed him over the heavy labor, the forced labor of the house of Joseph, who came up out of Egypt. So we have, we just have all these little hints in there that I think are, while none of them is a standalone, tug, each one of them is a little thread that's being pulled a little bit for us, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have Pharaoh's daughter, and who was Pharaoh also gave Hadad a wife, the sister of his own wife, who had nursed him or something along those lines, it seems. Anyway, just, busy in the world of family systems and multi-generational imperial conflict. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah, Louise.
Oh, just a huge question of you. What would you say is the message we're to get from this story of intergenerational stuff? I mean, if you could put it, I'm sure you can, because it's kind of getting too big for me to understand. So I need to understand what's the point of bringing all this in.
So I'll tell you what I do with it. I'm not sure that it's the point that the narrator wants us to see, but for me, so much of this story is about the way in which humanity is almost hopelessly lost. And it starts off with Adam and Eve, and it builds and it builds and it builds. And at times we're hopelessly lost because people they just can't help themselves but to be wicked or distray or be prideful or greedy or whatever. And other times you say we're hopelessly lost because we build systems that reflect our lostness. We build entire kingdoms or empires built around our faults instead of around Yahweh's perfect will, and so on and so forth. And while I say that, I also don't then hold anybody in contempt for it. It's almost freeing to say, like, what else were they going to do? This is us. And in all that, for me, the point that it drives to is that we had to be freed from this by something other than ourselves. And so for me, the way in which it gives way into the story of Jesus and the way in which Jesus frees us from the need to perform perfectly according to the standards of the statutes, laws, and ordinances, because Jesus did that on our behalf. For me, this is all about setting that stage. Now, it has explanatory power for a lot of the other experiences I have had in my own life of multi-generational conflict and pain. But I don't, that still to me is a floor or two down from the penthouse. The penthouse for me is really how this creates an interconnected story that stretches from the first humans through to the end, through to the end. Okay, Scott, Andy, Judy, and Louise, did you have more?
No, that helped me, and I'm thinking the challenge for me, and maybe for many of us, when the consequences of that intergenerational stuff hits us, I think my former response was to sort of blame God.
Yeah.
Instead to see, like, why is this happening to me, and why is this the way, blah, blah, blah. And I think I'm learning to see that it's God who allows the consequences of our fallen nature to direct some things, and then in God's own miraculous way can intervene, using us sometimes and not using us sometimes.
Right.
And that also is the history of why God's anger is slow. I think God allows all of this stuff that's really our fault, or our parents' fault, or our great-grandparents' fault, whoever it is. We all have our faults.
Yeah.
So that's kind of an aha for me, what to do with that personally.
Good. And there are so many different ways to approach it. But one of the redeeming qualities of the way that the Bible holds it for us is God's desire is almost always to, in the midst of that, to bring us back, right? Like, God doesn't want to utterly wipe out the Israelites so that there is no more of them. God wants to bring them back into relationship because they are way, way out of relationship and alignment now. And so, as God has done before, God's going to use this pain to try to create clarity and restore the Israelites. And that's there's something lovely about that in our own lives, right? Or at least in my life, I know that that's been a helpful thing to consider. It can also be a damaging thing to pass along to our kids, but that's a family systems therapy thing for another day. We'll skip that for today. Scott.
I think we've talked before about this concept of the sins of the father. The Bible had, especially in the Old Testament, when you talk about someone, it's the son of the son of the son of. And so for a relatively tight community, it would be like, oh yeah, I know who this guy is. You're making it very difficult to sort of be your own person, to say, no, and even in the New Testament, there were Jesus, in his own hometown, they go, no. We know who you are.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't possibly be somebody new or different, which, so I don't know if that ties into, the philosophy that you just talked about, as far as the going all the way back to Adam and Eve, and the fact that we're all stained by original sin and there's no escaping it. I guess all we can do is just keep trying harder.
Yeah. I think to draw the philosophy out a little bit, we'd say that the paradigm for human existence is such that there is the potential for intentional and unintentional sin. And sin is a whole massive concept to unpack. But at the very least, what we have to say is imperfection, right? The paradigm is imperfect that we are built according to, right? The standard that we are built according to. And I'm not a big fan of the language of original sin as a sort of a stain. It's a good metaphor, but it's complicated. And again, we don't have a ton of time for today. But in the acknowledgement that the paradigm is broken, that the model of human life is such that there will be imperfection, it frees us then from, or at least it can free us from the pursuit of perfection, and allows us, I think, to accept our fault, to accept our frailty, to accept our imperfection in such a way that we can approach grace differently, receive it differently, right? I know that I need to be forgiven. I know that I have things that are not perfect. I know that there will be things that are imperfect still, even after I receive the quote unquote saving grace of God, right? That doesn't clean up everything about me, but it starts, as you mentioned, Scott, just then, it starts a process by which I can always try again and look again to say, okay, well, yesterday didn't go so well, but tomorrow's another day. And I don't have to worry about whether or not my soul will utterly be destroyed forever. But can I draw nearer to God today than I did yesterday? And there's more to it within Christian thought, but for me, that's at least a part of where it goes. Landon just noted that the generational pain makes so much sense. The explanations are inserted into the text. It feels relevant to us today as the comfort for the freedom of perfection and the grace. Thank you, Landon. Yeah, good. So yeah, the language around family systems theory is Murray Bowen is the name of the psychologist that we want to give credit to for family systems theory, but Rabbi Ed Friedman is the one that we want to go to for understanding how it works among large people groups. And you can just imagine the fun that as a rabbi he had by going back and looking at these types of stories. They left this as a gift to us. They really did. Okay, Andy and then Judy.
Yeah, just quickly, it seems the world looks at things passed along generation to generation in terms more of body-based habits or addictions or even mental health or racism, whatever. But what is it from a spiritual perspective, from the Bible? I mean, it's the separateness of God. How we pass that along the generations. I mean, just from a pure spiritual perspective, what are the sins that we pass along? Or
It's a great question. I'm scanning for time to see how to address this the best. The concept of sin in the Hebrew Bible, which as it makes its way into the Christian scriptures, gets adjusted. Actually gets adjusted pretty majorly. But we can't begin to get into that today. But it's a concept that is almost without definition, right? Like it only exists in metaphorical definition. To use the word is to use the metaphor. There is no place where the word just exists on its own, which is really makes it all the more challenging. So stain works, right? Like sin from time to time. And we've seen it in the way that even the soil can be stained. We see these infractions of whatever sort being such that it feels like I'm dirty, right? I'm soiled. Weight, burden, this sort of thing that pushes down on us, that gets used a whole lot. Debt gets used more than just about anything else. Probably the word debt applies. And while we don't like to think of it in economic terms, it's the idea that there is somehow something that I owe, which also then allows us to have something that can be forgiven, just in the same way that stain means that we have something that can be washed, right? Burden means we have something that can be taken away, or in the case of the scapegoat, laid on something else. We have all these different metaphorical kind of worlds. Each one of them provides another extension of the metaphor for discussing how it gets passed along. At the very least, I think we need to discuss sin as a thing that is the consequence of an action or an inaction in some cases, but something comes into existence basically as a result of that. And that thing also seems to have some kind of power or influence. The only place where that gets a little bit screwy for us is if we go back and look at the Cain and Abel story about how sin is lying in wait to pounce upon Cain. It's a thing still, but it doesn't seem to have in that single verse been as easily associated with the sin that was passed into the world by Adam and Eve. There seems to be some sort of existential leap that happens there. But with that exception, virtually everywhere else, we can understand I have violated something of God's perfect will, and that has generated a thing. And that thing, debt, stain, burden, whatever it may be, that imperfection has some influence or power to cause other states to come into existence, including a state of sin for others. One last thing that I want to mention, just because we're in Deuteronomistic history, when we were back in Numbers especially, but elsewhere, we talked about the way that infection actually works really well for us to discuss this as a metaphor in our present terms, because the mere presence of someone in the group who is, to use the language of Numbers, is carrying that burden, almost guarantees that it's going to be shared communally, and that it's going to somehow work its way into soil and place such that other people who come onto that soil, even if it's after that other person has left who had the sin, they're going to be infected basically by their presence in that place. So, so that becomes a really apt metaphor for us. It's not one that the Bible is drawn to, but it's one that might almost work better for us conceptually. So much more there. Oh, we could have a whole class on this. It would be kind of fun and Lenten, appropriate for Lent. I want to get to Judy, and then I see Robin, and then Victoria has a comment in the chat we'll talk about. Judy.
Yeah, I was thinking about the Bible as a whole, that we all, as Christians, we study the Old and the New Testament. And to me, the Old Testament is more of a kaleidoscope of all human behavior.
Yeah.
The good, bad, and ugly.
Yeah.
And then the New Testament really kind of focuses so much more simply on an individual's life and what you can do with your life, regardless of what you know about all of the potentials for the negative.
Good.
Because to me, the Old Testament, it stops at whatever it stops, and you're kind of left with, all right, that's all interesting, but where do we go from here?
Yeah.
Whereas the New Testament says you have this, but here's where you go from.
Yep.
Here's where you take it, and then it's up to you. You know, it's up to every individual where they want to take their lives.
Yeah.
Do you want to be hung up on something that you had no control over?
Yeah. Good. So there are a couple of really important concepts that I want to make sure I lift out for everyone to hear. One is that in the Hebrew Bible, we are dealing with humanity in its whole, but a specific group of humans in the Israelites. But that's also not where we started in the Hebrew Bible, right? We started with just humanity as two individuals, and then we started with a family in Abraham, and we've been expanding. Now, if we reverse that ever so slightly, we actually started with the cosmos and narrowed down to an individual in Abraham, or an individual family. So we actually started very, very wide, and then we went to humanity, and then we went to a particular tribe, and now we've worked into a particular people group. But, and we talked about this a couple of years ago, but actually even just last year at the beginning of this series again. When it narrows down for us, if we see the scripture as a whole, to Jesus as an individual, before it starts to expand back out to all of the cosmos again. Revelation is a cosmic picture of salvation. The Gospels are very much about Jesus. Acts is about the spread through the Roman Empire, or to the heart of the Roman Empire. So a little bit of shorthand there, but this notion that you have what we would call a chiastic structure, very wide to very singular to very wide again. And one of the things that makes that possible is that in the understanding of the universe and just who humanity is in the ancient Near East especially, individuals aren't a thing. Like, there are individual people, but we are all so interconnected that there's just no point in talking. There's no individual salvation in the Hebrew Bible. It is collective always, no matter what, because there's no concept that it could be anything other than that. And it's in Greek philosophy that we really begin to have a concept of an individual soul, so to speak, that is somehow separate from other souls. And so in the New Testament, because we have such incredible Greco-Roman influence, we start to get language around the individual choice, individual soul, et cetera, et cetera. That actually almost gets played with and then removed by the time we get back out to the cosmic view. And that's probably really helpful for us who have gone through a couple thousand years of history in which, especially in the West, in which we understood individual. And now with, quantum physics and everything else that we've learned, we say, hey, that stuff about being an individual isn't quite what we thought it was. There's a lot more now that helps us to understand that individual experience or individual, discrete individual is also interconnected, interrelated, and there is no alternative to that, right? It's the way that all matter in the universe seems to be. I'm excited about the next 100 years or so of science in that field to help us, I think, go back and reclaim some of our origin story here. Okay, we're right at 11. I want to get to Robin and then to Victoria. Robin?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. This may be off track, but the whole concept of the generational sin made me sort of flip into white fragility. That is, and what we're taught, and that just keeps going generation to generation. It softens sometimes. Sometimes. But anyway, that it just sort of struck me as something that I can say I inherited.
Yeah, it's one of and we, right? One of the things that is another really helpful metaphor or example for us to consider is, and let me say this with acknowledgement that all sorts of people think all sorts of different things about racism. However, the United States was founded with slavery that was 100% designed to enslave African people with dark skin. Right? This was a fact. And you can complicate the fact however you would like to. And I'm 100% willing to say that the enslavement of other people is a sin. And argue with me if you want to, vocally, please. And while we're still recording on YouTube. Now, that all being said, when the institution of slavery ceases to be federal law, when there's an Emancipation Proclamation, however you want to understand that, do the consequences of that go away? Everything we know about sin from Scripture would say, of course not. And you better be willing to bet the greater the sin, so to speak, or the larger the burden or the debt or the whatever, the more generations are going to feel the consequences. So again, for whatever you want to say about our current state of affairs, we can't shrug our shoulders and say our current state of relationship to race has nothing to do with American slavery. It's impossible to think that in the same way that I can't separate my genetic code from the genetic code of my ancestors. It's what we've inherited, and it provides a really apt analogy. And then we have to say, well, then what can we do about it, right? That's another way of talking about it. What can we do with the consequences of any sin? And so, yeah, Robin, I think it becomes a really, really great way of looking at it. And it probably helps for us to discuss, I know we're going over time a little bit, the sins of, I'll just make it personal. The sins of my dad's father caused a set of consequences running through my family, right? The way that my dad related to him, the way that I relate to my dad, the way we all relate to each other, that's all there. And there's not much we can do about it other than to try to transform some of that stuff. And there would have been a time at which I said, I hated that man for all that he did to my dad. And I hated all this sort of stuff and everything else. And now I've come to a place where I say, I need to spend a lot less time hating him and a lot more time seeing how he is in me, that I am a product of him and his father before him, and so on and so forth. If I am going to understand me, I've got to be willing to do the analysis that allows me to see who I am as a result of this multi-generational transmission. Otherwise, I will be a slave to it. And that's not what I want. I mean, that's not what I think God wants for me. And so that then applies to these larger conversations as well, not only about American slavery, but beyond that, about humanity. If we're unwilling to take hard looks at it, then we really retain our powerlessness to make any significant changes. Okay, that's obviously a big can to unload, but we love to do that 5 minutes after 11 and see what happens. Okay, Vicky, I just noted something about Rohr's order, disorder, and reorder. Maybe we can come back and talk about that a little bit next week. I think it'd probably be good for us to get some definitions for everybody that share that. I read a lot of Rohr, and even in my mind, I don't know exactly what you mean by that. So I'm going to need some help. And then, so there's just a private comment about Jesus as the breaker of the cycle. Huge topic that we can't possibly do right now, but great thing to consider is one of the reasons that Jesus shares our humanity is to participate in it, but also the way in which the negative consequences associated with our generational transmission into humanity get pulled into him, and as Colossians would say, gets nailed to the cross in such a way that when God resurrects Jesus, it destroys it. It ends the cycle. It ends the cycle of mimetic violence and scapegoating. It ends the cycle of just over and over and over again. It ends that, or at least it declares the ending of it from a cosmic perspective. So that's helpful. We can come back to that next week too. I feel terrible about it's 7 after. I'm so sorry. These are all really great things. Let's say our prayers really quickly, and we'll get y'all out of here. YouTube crowd, we're going to say goodbye to you. Thanks for being with us. Sorry for going long. Of course, you have the option to just pause if you need to come back later on. But we'll see you again soon. If you ever want to join us on Zoom, reach out to me.